Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening. All we have amongst ourselves is time, and we so appreciate you sharing yours with us by listening to this program. This week, we have a special guest who actually is going to join us for a bit of the podcast intro, Mr. Russ Eagle. Before we go there, as I thank you for listening, I also want to thank those of you who have decided to support the show. You can do so by going to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. There's a number of different options there, and we do so appreciate it. So, Russ, you tell the true story of Clay stumbling up Mount Whitney, and I'm so glad that you've decided to share Clay's true colors with our listeners.
Well, thank you. It's been a number of years now since that first version aired here on the show. So it's, I've been tossing and turning at nights ever since. So it was great to get the chance to set the record straight. And I will be providing you with some photographic evidence as well.
Oh, very good. We'll try to get that up on the website. I particularly want to see him crawling with his 60 pounds of gear on his back. I hope you have a shot of that.
Well, this year when we got up to the top, the three of us, it was a beautiful day. When we went up the first time, it was a horrible day and cold, and we didn't linger because it was like a blizzard up there. The winds were fierce and the wind chill was horrible, and we were both really tired, and we had 17 miles or much of 17 miles to go. So this year the weather was perfect, and so we lingered for about 45 minutes, I would say, certainly 30 minutes. But the other two were dancing around and high-fiving and talking to complete strangers and, telling people what heroes they were. And I was lying on my back. I was like Theodore Roosevelt in the Amazon. I began spontaneously reciting Kubla Khan, Coleridge. When Xanadu and Kubla Khan his stately pleasure dome decreed, where Elf, the sacred river ran. And they're just having a good time, joking.
The two of you talk about Mount Whitney. You also discuss Stephen Ambrose and Lewis and Clark.
Oh, yes. Stephen Ambrose, I met him a number of times. I worked with him. I'm a good friend of his daughter, Stephanie, as I know you too are. And it's so easy to quibble with Stephen Ambrose. We all do it. I've done it. He's a triumphalist. He's a storyteller. He's a raconteur. He's a synthesizer. He borrowed too heavily from other people's work, etc. But you know what? When I reread the book, I thought almost anyone would want to have written that book. Of course, he had a great story to tell. The story, in a sense, just tells itself. But he wrote a book that has largely satisfied academic reviewers and has been a worldwide popular success. Whenever you want to quibble about Ambrose, you sort of have to say, holy smokes, was he good? So we have to we have to acknowledge that he did it.
Well, he was a great storyteller. I hate to use the phrase page turner, but it was. But then after that, the two of you moved on to another subject, and that was John Steinbeck.
So, we strained a little to make the Jefferson connection. I always like to keep it on Jefferson in some sense, but I think the connection is there. The name comes up, Russ, in a number of the books, including The Grapes of Wrath. He clearly was a Jeffersonian, and I think his sense of outrage was and I think Russ nailed it, and I haven't ever heard it said in quite that way until the show today, but you said something like, the Jeffersonian paradigm does not survive without some props, and those props were not in place. And so it led to one of the largest refugee problems in American history. And even though the Okies eventually were mostly absorbed into California and many of them prospered, it was a kind of a shattering anti-American dream story. And at the end of the novel, we don't know whether the Jodes are going to be okay or not. And I think, Russ, that was Steinbeck's purpose, is to say he did not want to tell us what happens to the Jodes. He wants us to be wondering, right?
Right. Steinbeck always said, stories don't have endings. Life doesn't end in some neat little package. And so he said, I try to end on a high point. I try to end on a message, but that's the best that I can do. And so you see that in his other novels as well. But I think I mentioned at the show, if you want to get the crux of what you're saying in a short time, just read chapter 14 of The Grapes of Wrath, where he makes this argument. It's only about 3 pages. But
we also devote a certain amount of time in the conversation to a book that you're writing, Russ. And without giving too much away, it's going to be about Cannery Row and your feelings about that, right?
Right. It's a celebration of a book that I think gets dismissed sometimes as slight and not up there with Steinbeck's best.
But you and I share a real appreciation for that book, I know.
Yes, I remember being thrilled a few years ago when you mentioned on the show that it was a favorite of yours. So
Yes, and I have a very vintage copy of it, thanks to you. And I treasure that and know right where it is. Anyway, with that, maybe we should go to the show. Any last words, Clay?
Well, I just want to again thank Russ for this. This is really important what he's doing. I want to be serious about this for a minute. Russ, writing a book is an ordeal. I mean, it's not for the faint of heart, right?
No, it's hard.
You've discovered that, of course. I mean, you think in your mind, oh, I could write this book and I'll have a chapter on this and this and this and this and this. And when you sit down, it's like, oh, there's a ton of research that has to be done, and you have to read and reread. And on any given day, your prose may not be cooperating with you, and life gets in the way.
On that note, let us go to this week's show. And Russ, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week we are joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, you have a special guest here, someone you know very well and have had many adventures with. I'm going to leave it to you to introduce him, sir.
Well, welcome, everyone. And this is a special edition of the Jefferson Hour. We're going to talk a little bit about John Steinbeck and a little bit about Mount Whitney and a little bit about Stephen Ambrose's great and famous book, Undaunted Courage, which is now 25 years old. So welcome to all of you. Our guest, David, is Russ Eagle, who's been on this program before, has hosted the program once or twice in the past. And Russ and I and another fellow by the name of Joe Lovell climbed Mount Whitney on August 25th, and we had lots of conversations, and we talked about John Steinbeck. And Russ is working on a really important John Steinbeck project, and now I'm working on one myself. So I thought we could talk about all of that. But first, welcome to Russ Eagle. I believe you're in Carolina today.
That is correct.
Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that one of the members of the Lewis and Clark crew was a North Carolinian.
Yes, that would be Corporal Worthington, who I guess is most famous for bringing the keelboat back from Fort Mandan.
Right. So they came up from St. Louis in the spring and summer of 1804, and the keelboat drew more than 3 feet of water. It was 55 feet in length. They knew they weren't going to be able to take it all the way to the source of the Missouri, and they sent it back on April 7th, 1805, with specimens and artifacts and some live animals, reports, letters, several discharged men, things they realized they would no longer need. And that was a pretty serious mission, Russ, because they had this period of tension with the Lakota near Pierce, South Dakota. And Lewis was afraid, I just reread this yesterday, he was afraid that Worthington and the keelboat would be fired upon by the Lakota.
Yes, and I think that's one of the discussions we had recently. I think that's one of the big missing pieces of the story, because I don't think we know a whole lot about. We know they made it back. We know the things they sent made it to Jefferson, but we know almost nothing about the adventure that they had. As for Corporal Worthington, I can tell you that's about all we know about his life. There are some local scholars who have done a lot of research and have been able to turn up nothing on Worthington other than his birthplace.
It was an important command that he got, so there must have been a high level of trust. He was somebody they did not need for the second year or the third year of their journey, but to make him the commander of the keelboat with all that precious cargo, this wasn't just discharged men and sending the boat down the river. They had to have great respect for him, and it's a pity that we don't know more about him. He didn't keep a journal. No one appears to have kept a journal. We don't really know 10 sentences about what happened on that long 1,610-mile ride back down to St. Louis, except that, so far as we can tell, they had no difficulties with the Teton, Lakota, or anybody else. But you Carolinians take some pride in having one of the members of the expedition, don't you?
Well, certainly there are some that do, and with the help of the foundation, some really nice signage has been erected at Corporal Worthington's birthplace, which is in eastern North Carolina. So, everybody's got to grab for their little piece of the story.
One of these days I will venture there, but it won't be high on my list. The new issue of We Proceeded On, which I'm just editing today, actually just finishing up, is going to be all about the late Stephen Ambrose, and it's the 25th anniversary of Undaunted Courage, which is not just about the expedition. In fact, let me read the subtitle of the book, Undaunted Courage, Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West, published in 1996. So Jefferson is a huge figure in this, particularly in the first 150 pages. So this is an important book. It's still the most readable, most accessible, most often read introduction to Lewis and Clark. David Swenson, you've worked on Lewis and Clark. You had some connections with Ken Burns' film, but you also, I believe, had some time with Steve.
Right. We were fortunate and got to meet Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns here at our studio. They had chosen to use some Native American music that we've recorded on our label, and it ended up in the film, which we were very proud of. We had this delightful evening at the studio after the premiere of the film here in Bismarck with Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns, and then we were invited to join them on their premiere from here to the coast. They showed the film. I remember being near Idaho, and it was at an outdoor drive-in theater that they sort of set up, that they showed the film. And
yeah, I was there with you. I didn't know you were there.
We didn't know each other. Ambrose really had a magnetic personality, don't you think? He was. A lot of people called him the coach. Let's go. Let's get this done. And but he had quite a personality.
You had some interactions with him on that journey. How you went to all these venues across the West?
I did. I actually drove from Bismarck all the way to the coast and recorded sound effects in locations that they had been, recorded Native American singers in locations that they had been, recorded a fiddler out in the woods and in the mountains of Montana, and hiked up some of the trails that existed there. So it was a great time. It was a long time ago, but I remember it well.
Indeed. Now, Russ, I don't think you met Steve.
I did not know.
But you have, partly at my suggestion, I think, reread Undaunted Courage over the past few weeks. And I'm just interested in your reaction. You know, it's been, for me, literally 25 years since I read it through. I've read parts of it dozens of times, but I've never read it through. I just did. What was your reaction?
Well, I missed the bicentennial in the sense that I was not into the Lewis and Clark story at that time. So I realized it was a very timely book and the role that it played in the bicentennial, but not necessarily for me. I had read a lot of other works by the time I read it. So to me, it reads more like an adventure story for young boys, that sort of thing. I don't like the fact that it sort of skips over. Really, to me, it skips over the whole last half of the journey, which I think is the most fascinating part for me. I think there's a great book to be written about the trip home, and I know you touched on it in your book quite a bit, actually. How you had 5 or 6 groups going different places, and so but for what Undaunted Courage reads to me more like a novel than history. But having said that, I do have a great deal of appreciation for what it was and the role it played. And really I know it's waning somewhat as the bicentennial slips away, but still there's a huge interest in Lewis and Clark across the country. In fact, we've experienced a lot of that this summer, and I think we owe a lot of that to Stephen Ambrose.
I think you really categorized it spot on, Clay. I mean, it became the introduction for so many Americans to this great, great story. And I am one of those, for certain.
Yeah, I reread it. I have a slightly more positive view of it than I think Russ does. I know Russ admires it. But it holds up really well. I marked my copy this time with hundreds of underlinings and little notations, and I'd put yes or excellent or no or disagree or quibbled with Ambrose on a number of occasions. But it has held up, and it certainly is the portal to Lewis and Clark for most people. It sold more than 2 million copies worldwide. It was published in a number of languages. And I say in this little essay that I've written for the opening of the We Proceeded On. By the way, people should subscribe. They can easily do so by going to the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation website in Great Falls, Montana. You subscribe and become a member, and you get 4 issues of We Proceeded On per annum, among other things. And so I urge people to do that. But in the little essay I wrote to introduce this celebration issue, I said that it was true that between around 1998 and 2010, I suppose I flew 100 or 150 flight segments per year. And I almost never got on an airplane where I didn't see somebody reading Undaunted Courage. People ask about what's the first book I should read about Lewis and Clark, and I won't ask Russ to answer that question here in a minute. But for me, I can't think of a better way for people, unless they want to read the journals. There's now a 1-volume edition of the journals by the great editor Gary Moulton, and there's a 1-volume paraphrase day by day by Gary Moulton. But unless you want to go to the raw documents themselves, I'm hard pressed to name a better introductory book. It's not the last book you should read by far, but it seems to me it's almost inevitably the first one. What do you think, Russ?
Oh, definitely. It's a great introduction. As for me, I came to Lewis and Clark through Jefferson, and I discovered your work through Jefferson, but I happened to come across the Jefferson Hour at the time you were finishing up your Lewis book. So that's what got me into Lewis and Clark, and that happened to be the first book that I read. And David Nicandre's was the second book, which, I've always, at some of the retreats we've been on, I've always sort of expressed the idea that I look at those as sort of bookends. They're totally different books, but they take the same perspective. But they're not introductory type books. They're for serious scholars. So I do think, there's no better introductory book than Undaunted Courage.
But something you said a minute ago, Russ, really struck me that, one of the disappointments of Undaunted Courage is that he's masterful in getting them to the Pacific, but then he sort of wraps it up quickly and gets them back to St. Louis and on to Monticello and Louisville and so on. That's a weakness of most 1-volume accounts of Lewis and Clark. And I think that in some sense inspired our friend David Nicandre to write his book, because his book is about Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, with a particular emphasis on the return, when Lewis, in his mind, was having a kind of a slow motion, nervous breakdown. David, I think we need to take a break. And when we come back, I would like to turn our attention not any longer to Stephen Ambrose on the 25th anniversary of his extraordinary publication, made him a very rich man and made him the most sought after speaker during the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. Unfortunately, he died in 2002 before he could really enjoy the accolades that he richly deserved. But when we come back, I want to quickly ask Russ about our ascent of Mount Whitney. There's been a lot of grumbling from Russ about the way I've characterized these trips in the past. Now we have the man himself. He can speak and tell it in his own way. But you're listening to a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Our guest is one of my dearest friends, Russ Eagle of North Carolina. When we come back, we will talk about John Steinbeck. But first, the ascent of Mount Whitney. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We are so pleased to welcome Russ Eagle as our special guest this week. And I know you want to talk about Steinbeck. I would be shocked if the two of you had a conversation that didn't include Steinbeck. But before we go there, I think we need to know the truth about Mount Whitney and what really happened. And I'm addressing that question to you, Russ.
Well, there have been 2 ascents of Mount Whitney over the past 4 years. This most recent time I did learn by my mistakes. I took a witness with me.
Wow.
After Clay's descriptions of our first trip to Mount Whitney, which I think was in 2017, I did comment to people that, I'd always known he wrote great books on history and the humanities, but I didn't know that he had such abilities with fiction. Clay can speak for himself, but for me, the most recent trip was much easier than the first time. The first time nearly killed both of us, I think.
Well, we're sort of assuming that people know about Mount Whitney, where it is, how high it is, how difficult of a climb. Is it a climb? Is it a hike? Can you give us a little background?
Mount Whitney is in the southern Sierra Nevada. To get there, to get to the trailhead, which is in a little town called Lone Pine, California, in the Owens Valley, we met in Las Vegas and drove through Death Valley, 3 or 4 hour drive, I think. Mount Whitney is the highest peak in the lower 48. It is 14,508 feet, I think, 14,508 or 14,505. You hear both, which is just a few feet higher than a number of other mountains like Mount Rainier, several others. It took modern times and modern technology before I think they could officially establish that Mount Whitney was the tallest. But you can get to the summit with no technical climbing abilities. It's a hike. The first time we did this, it was actually Clay's idea. And I can remember his words to me, there's nothing to it. Guys like us do it every day. The first time we did it, we camped at 12,000 feet in about 17-degree temperatures and 25-mile-an-hour winds. We were not suffering from altitude sickness, but we were suffering from the effects of altitude. And we only had a 2-day permit, so we were pushed. We had to go 17 miles on the last day to be up and down before our permit expired. So that's another thing. On the second time, we had a 3-day permit. So
this is part of the Sequoia National Park, isn't it?
Yes. Along the trail, you enter the Sequoia National Park. The John Muir Trail joins the Whitney Portal Trail about 2 miles from the summit. So a lot of things coming together. The Inyo National Forest, but it's a neat place to visit.
And of course, we're all concerned about the sequoias with all the wildfires. You didn't encounter any fires while you were there, I take it.
We did not see any fires, but we saw lots of smoke. The first year we went in 2017, I took this great photograph from down in Lone Pine of Mount Whitney, which I have printed in on my wall. But when we arrived this time, standing in the same spot, we could not even see Mount Whitney. Every day you would wake up on a clear morning, but the smoke would settle in. And then when we reached the summit, you could see in the distance where the smoke was coming from. So
you call it a hike that anybody can make, but if you get on the National Park Service websites and look, I mean, it's the photographs of it make it look like a pretty daunting hike. What do you say, Clay?
Yes, it is very daunting. We did it in 2017, and it was rough. I had cramps at 12,000 feet that were the worst cramps I've ever had, and I thought I was actually going to have to decline the last day. You begin the second day, you go up to 12,000 and camp, and then the next morning you go to the finish and back, and the first part of that hike is 99 switchbacks, which are essentially 99 switchbacks straight up the face of the mountain. It's a daunting thing to see at first light on the day you're going to ascend. We made it. Russ did better than I did by a considerable margin. So then we came back and said, on the way down, we said, never, ever, ever, ever again. But we decided to do it again, and we roped our friend Joe Lovell into coming along. For a long backstory to that. But this second time, I'm the living witness of the importance of the word hubris. I trained a little this time, which I didn't do last time, but not enough. And this time really humbled me in a big way. And I made it. We all three made it, but I suffered almost every step of the way. I should say, though, for the historical record, that I had really terrible problems with my left leg. And I have a vague memory of a kind of a Tanya Harding event on the first night where Russ was seen with a golf club outside my tent. I don't know if that's true, but I could barely walk. And Russ had trained like a Olympian. And so he was scampering up the trail and sneering all the time. And Joe Lovell was a little less well prepared than Russ, but he was chugging up the trail and looking back at me with pity and remorse. And I was crawling up the trail I had sticks, so I had really 6 legs. I was crawling up the trail and wishing I were dead, and we made it. Then we got down, David, 2 days, was it, Russ, later, they closed the mountain because of the fires. And I thought, timing is everything. Why couldn't they have closed it a little sooner, for goodness sakes? So this time when I came down, I said in a much simpler way, never again. How about you, Russ?
Oh, certainly never again. But, I had a fairly painless experience this time. I don't think you're giving yourself plenty of credit, but I think the one area where you don't give yourself enough credit is, that first time in 2017, you decided to try to do it with Edmund Hillary gear, early 20th century. I have pictures of this if you're interested, David, but, Clay was probably carrying 60 pounds of wool and flannel. And
I had the world's largest loaf of bread, David, from Schatz's Bakery in Bishop, California. I did it as a gift to my friend Russ. I stopped and bought it. It was like a 7-pound loaf of bread, and we carried it all the way up and all the way back. And I put my pack in the garage, and a year and a half later, I found petrified bread.
You can get online and find many, many photographs of Mount Whitney. And, to me, you're joking about it, but it looks like it's a pretty strenuous hike. And once you get to the top of Mount Whitney, it's like very old, broken down mountain. You must have felt right at home.
I did. I mean, I got to the top. We got to the top. I was actually, I know it sounds crazy, I was slightly better off this year when I got to the top in spite of all the pain, because you know what you're up against. The second time, you know how much more there is, how much more difficult it gets, how much more time is going to be required. And it makes a huge difference. But when I got to the top, I lay down for a while and tried to die. And only when they prodded me with their hiking sticks did I slowly, like a snake in October, return to life in some sense. And going down is, for me, is a piece of cake. My knees hold up on the down, but the up was truly horrific. And I take some solace, some tiny little solace in the statistic that 30,000 people start this hike and only 10,000 complete it per annum. And so Russ and I have done it twice. I don't want to push our luck anymore. But even now, Russ, now that weeks have passed, I feel a little happier about the trip because I realized, well, okay, but we did it. You have to wonder at about 13.5, when you still have a full mile up, why any rational person would do this.
I would take you up on your offer of sharing photographs, Russ. I'm hoping that you have some of Clay and his 60 pounds of gear and giant loaf of bread that we can share on the website.
I do. And, all the way up the mountain, everybody that we passed, every other hiker, they would look at Clay and say, what have you got in that pack? How many pounds are you carrying there?
That's not what they said. They said, how much you got in that pack, old man? They had two concerns. One was the 60-pound pack, although it paid off in some really surprising ways. But the other thing they thought was, if I were your age and in your condition, I'd have a guide. I'd have a Sherpa hauling that crap. And so they were sneering at me for other reasons. But be that as it may, we did it. And it is always good to test yourself in this way. And I know something I didn't know before, that you have to train hard. Russ trained hard. I didn't train hard. I did a few 12-mile hikes and I did a few stairs and I rode my exercise bike and I thought that should be enough. It's not, is it, Russ?
Oh, no, it's not. And for me, at least, it's got to be long-term. I'd been working for that for 6 months, not every day, but certainly I knew. And we do the Windover hike in July, so that's always a good time to see where you are and how hard you need to work between now and then.
Safe to say that this isn't going to turn into an annual cultural tour for the Jefferson Hour. What about Jefferson? Would he have ever, obviously he didn't travel, but say there was a way to whisk him out there. Is this something he would have done?
Yes, because first of all, he would have said, he wouldn't have done it. Nothing would have made Jefferson do it, but he would have brought a theodolite and a compass and surveying equipment, and he would have measured the height of the mountain from a base camp somewhere, and he would have sent Meriwether Lewis up or somebody else up on his behalf. Jefferson's not going to do such a thing, but he would be thrilled because then he would say to Europe, hey, talk about your Matterhorn, talk about your Mont Blanc, talk about the Alps. We have mountains in this country that dwarf yours. And he was always eager to vindicate America against the views of Europeans. So he'd be thrilled. And I think he would also be thrilled by California, which sort of leads us into the second half of our discussion, David, unless you have You want to shame either one of us?
Well, Jefferson would be impressed that gentlemen of your age would even attempt such a thing, don't you think? I guess I could put myself in that same category of your age, but Jefferson was outdoorsy. In spite of the fact that he was a homebody, he hiked the woods and rode every day. You don't think he would physically attempt something like this?
I do not. I do not. I think that he would have looked up. I mean, it's the very definition of the sublime. So, all joking aside, when you're at Lone Pine and you look up at that mountain, and there are about 7 of them, it's kind of hard to know which one is which. But when you look up at that the front of the Sierra, it takes your breath away. It's one of the most beautiful sights in America. But you are immediately aware of the sublime. And the sublime was that concept that the 18th century loved of being overwhelmed. When you look up from the parking lot at the Interpretive Center down in the base at Lone Pine, you think, this is going to be really, really difficult. And the drama of the thing, it's one of the most dramatic mountain faces. It's much more dramatic than Pikes Peak. I think it's more dramatic than Mount Rainier. And you see it and you think, well, it can't be done. I mean, you first of all, you think it just can't be done. Or if it can be done, it's just got to be an ordeal. But you're just stunned by the mass of this thing. Well, fortunately, you get to drive a long way to the put-in point. So if you had to walk from Lone Pine, most people would turn back before they ever got to the parking lot. But Russ, weren't you telling me as we drove through Death Valley? At that point, I was wanting to slow down to 20 so I could just roll out and die right there, but they wouldn't stop. Didn't you tell me there are people that run from Death Valley all the way to the base of the mountain and then up it in a single run?
Yes, there's an annual race that I think it starts at Death Valley at the lowest point in the lower 48 and then goes up Mount Whitney. And, they are surprisingly close together, but I mean, this is still a 100-mile race or something, or run.
Have you signed up?
No.
Well, let's move on to Steinbeck and the connection with all of this. I know you're anxious to talk about Steinbeck, and when it comes to the two of you, I shall be quiet and listen about Steinbeck.
Let me introduce this in a couple of ways, David. This is the Thomas Jefferson Hour, so we want to make sure we're talking about Thomas Jefferson, and that's certainly the case with Lewis and Clark and with mountain climbing. There are connections with Steinbeck, and we'll go into that in a minute. But I want to say that, and it's going to sound a little bit emotional, but you go through life, and there are very few people you can talk with about the things that matter most to you. Turns out that that's just the nature of things. And so David Nicandri and I call this the Republic of Letters, which is kind of a pretentious phrase from Jefferson's world, but all these sort of like-minded people found each other around the country and around the world, and they've corresponded and exchanged ideas and so on. Well, I have a little Republic of Letters. You're both in it. David Nicandri's in it. But Russ and I have discovered a mutual love of John Steinbeck. I think his love might be greater than mine, but it's big on both sides. And we have slightly different ways of looking at Steinbeck and different choices of the best work of Steinbeck. But as I think some people know, I perform as Steinbeck. And so Russ, a few years ago, who's been a lover of Steinbeck for decades, told me that he's writing a book about one of Steinbeck's novels, a novella called Cannery Row. And that just thrills me to think that, one of my closest friends is working on a book that he doesn't need to write. He's not trying to get tenure. It's not going to give him a greater pay. He's retired. A book is like Mount Whitney, only it goes on for a couple of years, just hard work. And here we go. And so the book is well underway, and I'm going to have Russ characterize it. But that has led me in turn to ask myself, well, if I were going to write a book about Steinbeck, what book would that be? And now I've formulated one, and Russ has given me the go ahead. I'm not trampling on any of his Steinbeckian territory here. And so both of us are now actively working on Steinbeck books, and we'll be leading the Steinbeck tour in Monterey in the spring, in March. And so people can come, but we're each going to give a presentation based upon the research that we're doing. So that's one of the Jefferson Hour tours. We've done it twice before. It's extraordinary because we're in Steinbeck country, talking in the morning about Steinbeck's books, and then in the afternoon going on these unbelievable excursions to some of the most beautiful places in America, all with a Steinbeck signature. So Russ, quickly tell us how long you've been at your love of Steinbeck and how this project came to your mind.
First, if you don't mind, if I could offer a Steinbeck quote that sort of emphasizes what you said there about your Republic of Letters. This was a letter that Steinbeck wrote to Peter Benchley, of all people, the author of Jaws, when he was a 16-year-old. Steinbeck just happened to be his landlord. That's a long story that's not worth telling here, but Steinbeck said to him, a writer out of loneliness is trying to communicate like a distant star sending signals. He isn't telling or teaching or ordering. Rather, he seeks to establish a relationship of meaning, of feeling, of observing. We are lonesome animals. We spend all life trying to be less lonesome. One of our ancient methods is to tell a story, begging the listener, and to say and to feel, yes, that's the way it is, or at least that's the way I feel. You're not as alone as you thought.
That's great. I want you to reread a couple of sentences of it after we take a short break here. We're in a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. David Swenson is here at Makoche Studios. I'm across town in my own New Enlightenment Radio Network home studio. And Russ Eagle is in Salisbury, North Carolina today. The miracle that Jefferson would not be able to understand that three people spread across a continent can not only talk to each other, but watch each other talk. It's absolutely magical from a Jeffersonian point of view. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'm going to ask Russ to reread the first two sentences of that extraordinary Steinbeck quote, and then we'll hear more about his project.
And when we return, I would like to get the both of you to perhaps share some more information about Mr. Steinbeck, perhaps a short biography of sorts, on the off chance that there are some listeners who don't know much about him. Would that be possible, sir?
Yes. The question is whether we can do it briefly.
Well, briefly or not, I would like to hear it. And also, I know you have an upcoming cultural tour involving John Steinbeck, and I think it would be appropriate for you to share some information about that with our listeners. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about all things Jefferson, this week with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and our special guest, Russ Eagle, the one who tells the truth about Mount Whitney. And we're so glad you do.
The truth as he sees it, of course.
Of course. We've been talking most recently about John Steinbeck, and I asked before we took the break, I was kind of hoping that the two of you might provide some sort of a biography or put Steinbeck in his proper place for listeners who don't know much about him.
Yeah, let me start by pretending I am Steinbeck. Here's what he would say. I was born in California. I wrote a bunch of books. You can find them almost in any library. If you want to read them, please do. There isn't much about me that you really need to know. Go ahead, Russ.
That is the truth. In fact, in my own project, that's sort of one of the first half of my book, would really tick Steinbeck off because it's looking at the backstory. And he thought that had nothing to do with what was between the covers of the book. If you couldn't get what he was saying there, then you just weren't going to get it, was his contention. And he was not posing in this stance. In about 1935, he had been writing for 6 years and had made less than $800. And Covici Fried offered to print Tortilla Flat, which would go on to be his first best-selling book. And they asked for a photo and some biographical information. And Steinbeck said, well, if you need all of that, let's just forget it. He said, I can't deal with that. I can't write books if people know who I am.
Okay, so we're going to go flat on the biography bit. How about...
No, but let's quickly do it. He was born in California. He went to Stanford briefly, never graduated. He had great literary interests from childhood, remembering when he first learned that words rhyme, when he first read the Thousand and One Arabian Nights, when he first read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, when he first read the Arthurian cycle of Arthur and the Round Table and his knights. And these got into his soul early, and he knew he wanted to be a writer, and he wrote a lot of things that didn't succeed until Tortilla Flats. Was that 1934?
35, I think.
Suddenly he's a considerable national figure, but just beginning. And then he wrote Of Mice and Men, which just kind of rocked America and became a famous Broadway play and a film, a great film. And then, of course, Russ, he became interested in the plight of the Okies, which brings Jefferson in.
Right. Well, I think of Mice and Men even brought Jefferson in. Steinbeck grew up in sort of the Jeffersonian world of the small farmers. Jefferson was big into, he tried to sort of revamp the system of land distribution in Virginia, I know, early in his career. And Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath are just full of references and little speeches from characters about how important the ownership of land was to a man's life and dignity. But one of the reasons Steinbeck is so misunderstood, I think, is because he made his reputation in that time, and everybody assumed he was, the pro-labor, proletarian voice of the Depression. And that's not really how Steinbeck would have defined himself. But that's what was going on in his world at the time. His views came from experience rather than ideology. So he went out and spent time with the Okies, and then his wife at the time said he fell in love with them. And that's where those projects came from. World War II came along, and that crisis passed, and, the country moved on, and Steinbeck moved on. But so much of his readership was looking for, the sequel to The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck had this fear of repeating himself. He would not do anything that he considered, doing the same thing twice.
The Grapes of Wrath, as I think everyone knows, is about displaced family farmers, that the family farmers of Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, eastern Montana, they were displaced by this perfect storm of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was one of the worst man-made environmental disasters in human history, and it really dumped tens of thousands of people to the West Coast because they were foreclosed upon and their land could no longer produce anything. And the title, The Grapes of Wrath, is about the moral outrage of growers destroying food rather than feeding these poor Okies. They're treating the Okies as if they were aliens who had no rights, who were not American citizens, who did not deserve even minimal dignity and comfort. And when Steinbeck saw all this in the Central Valley, saw the way the great growers were treating these helpless refugees, it angered him, but he managed to control that anger and produce one of the world's great books, The Grapes of Wrath. So it's very Jeffersonian, and there are Jeffersonian characters in the book. And I think Jefferson would be fascinated by this. And it's happening a little bit again today, this displacement by AI and robotics. But to go back to your work, Russ, it's not on The Grapes of Wrath. I know you love that book. Your work is on Cannery Row. So quickly, tell us what Cannery Row is and what you're doing with it.
Well, after The Grapes of Wrath, as you know, the hullabaloo and the controversy that followed, Steinbeck did become a public figure, did become rich and famous, and, it nearly killed him. It destroyed his marriage. It drove him out of California. It drove him away from the novel. Oddly enough, a travelogue, half scientific catalog, nonfiction that he co-wrote with his friend Ed Ricketts, Sea of Cortez, which is another fascinating book, but certainly not what you would expect to follow The Grapes of Wrath. Unfortunately, the day after it was published, Pearl Harbor happened, and so nobody really read or reviewed Sea of Cortez. Then Steinbeck threw himself into the war effort. He was a very patriotic man. But if you take the war work out of the discussion, because that's a whole another discussion, the next book was Cannery Row. It's a short book. It's an odd book. In fact, Steinbeck's biographer, Jackson Benson, actually made the comment that it reminded him of a Jefferson favorite, Tristram Shandy, in the sense that nothing happens in the book. It's just, a series of episodes. And the reviews, needless to say, were, this is what you followed the Grapes of Wrath with, this story about bums and prostitutes on the Monterey waterfront. And so I don't know. I don't really look at my book as a defense, but more as a celebration. There's a lot in that book. You just have to unpack it. A lot of Steinbeck's themes that, this book actually fits in perfectly with the work that preceded it. And in fact, Grapes of Wrath and Sea of Cortez and Cannery Row have really a neat relationship, I think, among Steinbeck's work. There's certainly not any sort of trilogy, but there's certainly thematic threads that connect these books together. So, I just am hoping to explore those and maybe, increase the appreciation and the joy they get out of reading that book, because it's a fun book to read.
My sense is that you're about a third of the way through this process. You've written a number of chapters. The rest are outlined. You're doing active work and writing essentially every day. So it'll be an exploration of this novella, which is about these sort of colorful ne'er-do-wells, but at the center of it, there's a character much like his dear friend, and that character here is called Doc. I don't think it can be called his greatest book, but it's, for you, your favorite. When will you have your book done, do you think?
If I can stay home and work on it, Clay, I've got to stop hiking up these mountains for a while and stay home. I'm hoping to finish it in 2022.
And so the first half is sort of the backstory of how this novella came to be in 1946. And then the second half will be an interpretive reading of Cannery Row.
Right, which I'm just getting into. The first half is, the draft of the first half is more or less done. The part that I'm looking forward to getting into is beginning right now. So I'm excited about it.
Me too. I look forward to that book. As time slips away from us during this conversation, there's a couple things that I would like to address, if I might, gentlemen. Well, the first is I really think you should tell us a little bit more about the Steinbeck tour, when it's going to be, where people can find out more about it, and what it encompasses.
Yeah, Russ will have the details, but let me start by saying there's an irony here, isn't there, Russ? Because you go to Monterey now and you see the place that was a smelly working class fishing village in Steinbeck's time. It's now one of the great destination tour places in the United States. It's absolutely magnificent. The great aquarium is there, which is one of the best things I've ever seen in my life. The restaurants are fabulous. The surrounding shorelines are amongst the most beautiful interactions of sea and land in the world. And so when you go there, it bears almost no resemblance to the shabby, smelly fishing town of Steinbeck's time. But Russ, you have details on the trip.
Right. The trip is in March. The dates are on the Jefferson Hour website. We're going to be at Asilomar Conference Grounds, which is right on the coast. You can walk out your door to the tide pools that Steinbeck examined and wrote about in Cannery Row and a number of other books. We hiked to the summit of Fremont's Peak. That's not a Mount Whitney type hike, but it's where Steinbeck sat when he wrote that poignant chapter at the end of Travels with Charlie, where he saw Steinbeck country for the last time. We go to Point Lobos, which has been described as the greatest meeting of land and water in the world. It's where Steinbeck's family had his memorial service. It was a favorite place of his. We have lunch at the house where Steinbeck was born and where he grew up. We go and see Rocinante, the truck that Steinbeck drove around the country in Travels with Charlie, and a lot of other things. And just seeing Steinbeck country is something to see.
We actually go to this interpretive center in Salinas, and there's Rocinante, the camper van. Back then, it was a big, crazy, new, innovative thing, and he drove. Russ and I share a fascination with that book, that late book, Travels with Charlie, which is sort of his farewell to America in some ways, but also his attempt to re-engage with America after spending so much time being a famous man. But that pickup is there, and the camper is there, and you can peer inside through plexiglass, and it just makes you want to get on the road yourself. David, you read Steinbeck at some earlier point in your life, I feel certain.
Yeah, and that sort of leads me to my next and final question, which is, we all are shaped to some degree by those that we read, particularly in our younger years. And both of you are avid Steinbeck readers. What is it about his writing? I ask both of you, what is it about his writing that has drawn you to his work and stayed with you throughout your lives?
Well, Steinbeck has a lot in common, I think, with another of your favorites, Clay, Thoreau. He sees observing nature and being part of nature. He sees nature as a teacher, as your text. The wise man in Steinbeck's books is sort of defined by his relationship to the natural world. And Steinbeck was as good as anybody about describing and writing about the natural world. So that's certainly what drew me in initially.
For me, when I started to do Steinbeck, I kind of took on the character before I really knew what I was doing. I knew I loved The Grapes of Wrath. I knew that I loved Travels with Charlie. I knew that I loved Cannery Row and Of Mice and Men. Early in life, he realized that he's one of many people who have this realization that there are only a handful of plots, a conflict between man and woman, conflict between man and man, conflict between man and society, conflict between man and God, the struggle for happiness, jealousy, betrayal, hate, fear, that really all stories are reweavings of a very basic story stuff. And you can find that in the Bible and in the Arabian Nights as well as you could ever find it in Hemingway or Faulkner or Emily Dickinson, etc. And so that really fascinates me. And he's very programmatic. East of Eden is really the story of Cain and Abel told in several different ways. And Tortilla Flats is really a story of King Arthur and his knights told in a very odd and fascinating way. Of Mice and Men, based upon Robert Burns' poem, The Best Laid Plans of Mice and Men Getting Off to Glay, that, what John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're planning it. Those things really fascinate me. And that leads, I'll just quickly say what my project is. I'm working on a book now on Steinbeck and The Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, the Arthurian cycle. And it's a long and fascinating story of a discovery that was made in Winchester in England in the 1930s of the original manuscript of The Morte d'Arthur. Caxton printed a version of it. It was the first book printed in the English language. And Steinbeck became utterly obsessed with this. He went to Great Britain a number of times. In the 1950s, he met Eugene Binaver, who was the great Malory scholar. A book has never been done on this connection, and so I'm doing that. So Russ and I are taking on different projects. He's farther along than I am, but in the Steinbeck world, and they both fill holes, David. There's no adequate book on Cannery Row, and there's certainly no adequate book on the Arthurian cycle.
If I might, one more question for the both of you in the few moments that we have left. If you had to choose a Steinbeck book that you were going to give to Jefferson to read, what would it be and what would his reaction be?
Go ahead, Russ. I know my answer.
Oh, it has to be The Grapes of Wrath now. I don't know what his reaction would be, but I think, if you read, I would just say, to listeners to read chapter 14, because I think Steinbeck's point was the Jefferson's agrarian vision for this country is not enough in itself. That there have to be connections beyond that. And I think that was the major point of that book.
Yeah, Jefferson, I agree 100%. The Grapes of Wrath, Jefferson would, I think, found it fascinating and really upsetting that good people, salt of the earth people, they're not intellectuals, they're not sculptors or artists, they're salt of the earth people, minding their own business, working the land, worshiping the God in their own way, are suddenly displaced by forces they can't understand, by mechanization that they didn't help bring about, by an environmental disaster that they played almost no role in perpetuating. And then they wind up in the promised land. Still to this day, David, California is the promised land of America. They get there and it turns out to be a bitter disappointment because of the maldistribution of the fruits of life. And if Jefferson was onto anything, it was the maldistribution of the fruits of life. So it's a very Jeffersonian book. I think you'd be shocked. And it's also the most accessible great novel of the 20th century. Try reading Light in August or Joyce's Ulysses. Then you read The Grapes of Wrath. It is accessible to an 8th grader and to somebody who spent her or his whole lifetime reading English literature. Russ, I can't thank you enough. We've only touched the beginning of this. We all wait for your book on the cultural tour. I'm going to ask you to give a morning session on it and to read from the book. When it comes out, we'll have another session of the Jefferson Hour. It's thrilling for me to think that you're doing this and that you see the end in sight. And David, here's the fun of it. If he just would stick to doing it, he wouldn't lead me on these incredible adventures that wind up breaking my back and postponing the publication of his authoritative book on Cannery Row.
Much as I'd like to give Russ a chance to respond to that, I'm going to relieve him of that duty and say, gentlemen, we are out of time for the week.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.